There you go.
Well, I'd like to start with a brief apology, which is I've just moved into a new office. Carol and you both noted the nice library that I have in the back. I'm very excited about the office, but this is my first afternoon Zoom session since daylight savings time began, and so the sun is right in my face. So if I look a little askew, it's because I'm trying to avoid that. And now that I know what daylight savings time does to my back window, I will adjust accordingly in the future. Thank you for doing this evening to discuss my book, The Power and the Money, which is over my, I guess, right ear. No, my left ear. Anyway, it's behind my head, and it is a book about presidents and CEOs, big name CEOs. Think about Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and Henry Ford and Henry Luce, going up all the way to the current day, in which I talk about Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and Jamie Dimon and Tim Cook. So it is a study of how CEOs have interacted with presidents over the last 150 years and talks about what this means for our country, what it means for our government, how the two groups, government and big business and big government, have gotten increasingly entangled over the years, the rise of a regulatory state that didn't really exist when John D. Rockefeller was building his empire, and the way in which that both corporations and big business and big government are part of our daily lives in a way that they were not at all when I began the story back in 1870. So let's start with then. In 1870, you could go about your average day without having any interaction with a big corporation and almost no interaction with the federal government other than perhaps when it delivered your mail. That began to change in that decade, especially in the 1870s, when John D. Rockefeller started to build his petroleum empire. I call my chapter on Rockefeller's building the blank slate because there was very little in the way of government regulation. It's actually the fact that some presidents noticed and commented on his sharp-elbowed monopolistic tactics in building his empire, but they had no tools, no arrows in the quiver with which to address what Rockefeller was doing. And between 1870 and 1880, Rockefeller builds this massive empire. By 1880, he has is about 90% of the refining capacity of US petroleum, just a very short period. Now, Rockefeller, there's good and bad in Rockefeller, I argue in the book. And one of the things that Rockefeller was trying to do was to self-regulate or have private sector regulation of a very tumultuous and combustible product. The reason he called his company Standard Oil is because there was no standard by which you could get petroleum products, no reliability to these products. And he called it Standard Oil because the idea was that if you purchased his product, you would know it was reliable and not combustible and safe. And so he was trying to do private sector regulation of his product before the government had even prepared to start doing that or even understood that it could, I would argue. But Rockefeller, again, as I said, had very sharp elbow tactics. He was in bed with the railroads, and they got favorable rates for distributing his product because it's not just about getting the oil out of the ground, and it's not just about refining it, it's about distributing it. And controlling the railroads was part of his model. And this led to a lot of unhappiness with the way he would force out other companies. The other model that he was known for is he would go into an area, sell his product cheaper than anybody else, force the other sellers or force the other manufacturers and distributors out of business because of his undercutting their prices, and then he would purchase their companies for a song, and that is how he built his massive empire. So politicians are getting increasingly unhappy with Rockefeller. There are also journalists who are writing about him, including a woman named Ida Tarbell, who writes this groundbreaking series about him in McClure's magazine in the early 1900s. This, interestingly, is after Rockefeller had retired from the day-to-day management of the company, but it is during the administration of Teddy Roosevelt, the progressive trust buster. And Roosevelt sees Rockefeller as a very fat target and goes after him and is critical of him and goes after his company. And he starts the process by which the breakup of Standard Oil would eventually happen. It happens after Roosevelt is no longer in office because the Supreme Court had to rule on it. But Roosevelt definitely sets it in motion. And there is certainly bad blood between the two men. At one point, Roosevelt asks Rockefeller to come down to Washington to talk about his industry. It's sort of a quasi hearing at the White House, but Rockefeller begs off, saying he is in poor health. But Rockefeller also is known for his daily golf game, and he didn't stop playing golf in that period when he said he was in too poor health to go visit the White House. So that kind of irked Roosevelt, understandably. And then eventually, when Rockefeller is not that involved in the day-to-day business, Roosevelt still uses him as a target and claims that he is the one who is directing the efforts against what Roosevelt is trying to do. It's actually not true, because Rockefeller, I think one of his deficiencies was he lacked an understanding of the power of government and how government could affect him and his business. He thought he was too big to be bothered by government, and this, as we will see, is an affliction that other big CEOs would suffer from in the years ahead. But in any event, Roosevelt is eventually successful in breaking up the company. As I said, it's after his presidency. It's during the presidency of William Howard Taft, his chosen successor. And Rockefeller learns about the breakup of his beloved company while he is, of course, on the golf course. And he's playing golf with a priest, not his priest. He's Protestant, not Catholic. And he gives the priest 3 brilliant words of financial advice upon hearing this devastating to him news. He says, buy Standard Oil. And he was right, because if you'd bought Standard Oil at that low moment, at that moment when the company was being broken up, when many people were presumably selling their stakes, you would have gotten a piece of all the companies that Standard Oil became, including Chevron and Exxon and Mobil and British Petroleum and so many others. And so it was perhaps the best piece of financial advice ever given on the golf course. And I say that advisedly because I know there's been a lot of financial advice given on golf courses. But Rockefeller understood the financial system. He understood how to make money, but he didn't understand the role that government was going to play. Now, this becomes a recurring theme in my book, In the Power and the Money, because there are other CEOs who make this mistake. I also talk about Lew Wasserman, who is a Hollywood mogul who has very little interest in government. He's asked by the other moguls to go to fundraisers and participate in political events. At the time, it's a far cry from where we are now, but at the time, most of the moguls were Republicans, not Democrats. But Wasserman's not interested really in either party. But then he wants to go from being an agent to a studio head, and that violates some antitrust rules. And Robert F. Kennedy's Justice Department goes after him, and suddenly he realizes the necessity of engaging with government. He realizes that government can get in the way of his very carefully laid out plans. And so he starts to befriend presidents. He initially befriends John F. Kennedy. Kennedy dies not that long after, tragically, in the assassination, but Wasserman becomes very close to Lyndon Johnson and does a number of fundraising events for him. One fundraising event was my particular favorite, in which he wants to reserve the Coconut Grove for a fundraiser for Johnson. Now, the Coconut Grove is a legendary venue in Los Angeles area. It was the site of the Academy Awards for many of the first years in which the Oscars were held, but it was also a popular site. And when Wasserman calls the Coconut Grove and says that that he wants to reserve the Coconut Grove for the night when Johnson is going to be in town. And remember, when Lyndon Johnson's the president, it's not so easy to move his schedule. He is told by the proprietors at the Coconut Grove that the Coconut Grove is not available on the night in question. Well, Wasserman indignantly asks, why? How could it not be available? Who's using it the night that I want it, that the president needs it? And he's told that there is a bar mitzvah that is going to be taking place that very night. And so Wasserman gets the name of the bar mitzvah family and calls the father of the bar mitzvah boy and says, I need the Coconut Grove on that night. The father is similarly indignant, and he says, well, it's my son's bar mitzvah. What do you need it for? And he says, well, I need it for a fundraiser for the president of the United States. So at this, the father thinks about it, and he says, I'll tell you what, I will let you have the Coconut Grove if you let my son and me meet the president. Seems like a fair deal, and they strike the bargain. But a few minutes later, phone rings again. It's the father of the bar mitzvah boy again calling, and he says, you know that deal we made? We can do it, but the rabbi also has to meet the president. And so once the deal is struck, the rabbi also meets the president, and then they do have the fundraiser. But Johnson and Wasserman became very close. They would stay up late at night and have deep conversations. In fact, one time he was in Johnson's bedroom in the White House very late at night, and he leaves and he runs into Lady Bird Johnson. And he apologizes to her for keeping the president up so late. But she says, no, Lew, you don't understand. He lives for this kind of conversation, because there's something in the book and The Power of the Money that I talk about called the loneliness of leadership. One of the reasons there's this interesting connection between CEOs and presidents is because they're both at the top of their respective organizations. They have no peers within their organizations, and therefore nobody they can truly trust, nobody they can really rely on. And so they look to people of similar stature. And that's why sometimes you see these close relationships between CEOs and presidents developing. You know, Wasserman is not only close to Johnson, but he's close to other presidents as well. He is very close to Ronald Reagan, who he was Reagan's Hollywood agent back in the 1940s, and even gets Reagan his first $1 million contract. And then he has a falling out with him over politics because Reagan becomes a Republican governor of California and Wasserman is a Democrat. But nevertheless, they refriend, or they become friendly again when Reagan is president. And in fact, at one point, Wasserman goes to the White House to intercede on a regulatory issue that would be adverse to the studios that Wasserman represents. And Reagan actually goes along with Wasserman's recommendation, even though Wasserman's recommendation is what I would call the non-free market approach to the question. It's a very complicated one. You can read about it in The Power of the Money, but Wasserman convinces Reagan to go along with this non-free market approach, and shows the benefits and the advantages of having a CEO close to a president for the company in question. Another person who makes this mistake of initially underestimating Washington is Bill Gates. Bill Gates builds an empire very much like Rockefeller, sort of out of the public eye in a very short period, with sharp elbow tactics, by a monomaniacal focus on the issue, on his company, and building it up and knocking out other competitors. And they don't pay much attention to him in the Reagan and Bush administrations, but in the Bill Clinton administration, they take a different approach to antitrust, and they do look askance at what Gates has been doing, and they start going after his company hard. Interestingly, during the Clinton administration, Clinton is also befriending Gates, and he plays golf with him at Martha's Vineyard, and he has Gates over to the White House for tech summits. And it's very interesting. I call this the compartmentalization of presidential politics. Here you have a situation where Gates's company is being pursued by the Justice Department, but the president, who's above the Justice Department, and Gates are developing their own personal relationship. Nevertheless, Gates underestimates government and is burned by it. The Justice Department takes a big whack out of Microsoft, and eventually Gates leaves the head of Microsoft, the CEO position, and goes to focus on philanthropy. And I suggest in the book that it had something to do with his inability to figure out a strategy for how to deal with government. And Gates himself recognizes this. In fact, when he meets a young Mark Zuckerberg, a guy who very much models himself after Gates, he starts programming at an early age. He's from an upper middle class family. He goes to Harvard and drops out to focus on his business. So he really sees himself as a proto Gates. Gates says to him, get an office there now. And by there, he means Washington, D.C., because no longer can CEOs afford to ignore government. Gates had this idea that government is 1/3 as fast as the private sector, and the high-tech sector is 3 times faster than the regular private sector. So he says, we're 9 times faster than government. Well, that's great, but government's real big, and if it grabs you by the ankle, it's not letting go. And so Gates learns that to his detriment, but tries to pass on this better lesson to his successor. And indeed, Mark Zuckerberg builds a very powerful office in Washington, D.C., a very powerful Facebook presence here, with a lot of well-staffed and well-compensated Republican and Democratic lobbyists alike. And as we can see in recent years, Zuckerberg is also willing to be ideologically flexible. In 2008 and 2012, his aides helped get Obama elected with their use of technical advice on the social media world to the Obama campaign. But then by 2024, especially after the Biden administration is very critical of Zuckerberg and of Meta, and Biden even says at one point, I don't like Zuckerberg, I don't like Meta. So Zuckerberg kind of changes the tune, and especially after Trump's election, he's been very critical of Biden publicly and has shown a willingness to be somewhat supportive of Trump, and even went to the Trump inauguration. So that kind of brings us to the current moment where Elon Musk is perhaps one of the most involved senior advisors, outside advisors to a president in history. He's a CEO, and also he's an advisor. This is not completely without precursors. In fact, in the book, I talk about a guy named Henry Luce, who is the founder, editor, publisher of Time magazine, who kind of like Musk in 2024, he goes all in for Eisenhower in 52. And he provides staff for Eisenhower, and he provides his platform, Time magazine rather than Twitter/X, to support the Eisenhower campaign. He also, like Musk, suffers some backlash from it. Time, which used to be seen as a somewhat even-handed magazine, starts to be seen as a more partisan organ, a very pro-Republican organ in those days. And there's even a joke going around that Time is very even-handed. Half the time it backs the Republicans, the other half it bashes the Democrats. So, but it doesn't necessarily benefit Time to be seen in that way. And the smart set, the intellectuals, start to denigrate it. And so the platform is the source of his power, and by having it diminished, that actually diminishes Luce's power. But again, Musk is unique in some ways, but also has historical precedence in other ways. And really, this brings us to today. The story of the book is about how CEOs for 150 years have tried to befriend presidents, sometimes clashed with presidents, some clashes uglier than others. Henry Ford, in particular, was a Roosevelt hater and would tell anti-Roosevelt jokes. But other CEOs have tried to befriend presidents. Jack Welch knew 10 different presidents, had pretty good relations with just about all of them, played golf with multiple ones, was asked to join the cabinet multiple times. But Welch also recognized that the CEO and being a cabinet member were somewhat incompatible. When you are a CEO, you are in charge of your organization. When you are a cabinet member, you report to the president, and the president is your boss. And when you work in government, you can't just say, do this, do that. You can't just snap your fingers. Welch was known for getting rid of the lowest performers in his organization every year. When you are at the Department of Commerce or Department of Labor, you can't necessarily do that. Now, I understand that Musk is testing that proposition, but it has not been that understanding with civil service protected workers for the last 75 years or so. So the story in The Power of the Money is really one that is quite relevant today, that has many historical antecedents, but it also is a constantly unfolding one. It's a story that is going to continue to be relevant in the 21st century as the tech stocks are a bigger and bigger part of our economy, and also a bigger and bigger part of our daily lives. And with that, I will take a break and be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, as a reminder, everybody has come in muted. If you have questions, while we let Tevi get some water and catch his breath, if you have questions, please either put them into the chat or unmute. And I will look to see if anybody seems to have a hand up. Carol, I see you've unmuted.
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much for joining us, Tevi. I could listen to you for a few hours, and that's partially because you're such a scholar on these matters, but I'm inherently interested in politics, as many people find themselves for decades in Washington are. So thank you for both your insights conceptually and then the stories, which really bring people to life. I'm going to ask a question, and please answer it in any way you find most comfortable. But looking at the relationship between Elon Musk and what he's doing for President Trump and the stated purpose moving forward, and then looking back at history, does history tell us anything about where Elon Musk's situation with the federal government and his leadership is likely to go, or is this fairly unique or hard to tell? Just a pretty open question about where you see all this going, but based on history. So please know that we're not calling up the New York Times and quoting you or anything. I'm just curious to know what you really think.
That's fine. I'm actually in the process of doing a study of other kind of big name outsiders who came and worked in non-traditional ways in presidential administrations, as sort of outside advisors. And there have been a number of them. There's a guy named Colonel Edward House who worked for Woodrow Wilson, but never actually had an official role in the administration. He was incredibly powerful. He basically ran foreign policy and World War I for Wilson. And he was incredibly close to Wilson. Wilson, according to House, didn't even read the newspapers that much. He would just get summaries from House, so House could kind of shape how things went. House, kind of like Elon Musk, tried to populate the administration with his people. He wanted to be more in charge of patronage than have a position himself. But at the end of the day, they also had a big falling out over Versailles and the treaty conversations in which Wilson felt that House gave up too much in the negotiations with the European powers, and he also didn't like House's advice to deal with Republicans in trying to get the treaty passed through the Senate. The truth is, House had good advice, and Wilson was misguided, I would say, in the way he approached the issue. But to be fair, perhaps to Wilson, even though he's not one of my favorite presidents, he was kind of in the throes of the malady that would eventually cripple him and lead the last year of his administration to be bedridden and his wife mostly running the country. But in any event, he and House have this falling out, and they actually, after have this falling out, they never speak again. So there are a number of these instances where these outside advisors came in and it didn't end well for them. This wasn't the case in all of them. I have some other cases, like a guy named William Knudsen came and helped Franklin Roosevelt industrialize with the war production in World War II. He's just a civilian, although a corporate executive, and he's made a lieutenant general in the Army by Roosevelt, the only time this has ever happened. And he basically takes over industrial production for the United States government and helps ramp up production so that we are able to build the armaments necessary to take on the Germans and the Japanese in World War II. So I think there's some varied stories in this, and sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. But there's a lot of egos involved, and there's a lot of high stakes stuff going on. So, and there's also a lot of enmity, and a lot of these people became very unpopular as a result of their work in government. Hugh Johnson headed the National Recovery Administration for Franklin Roosevelt in the early years. He was a former Army general. And interesting, in contrast to Knudsen, who was a civilian, became a general. Johnson was a general who became a civilian, I guess, administrator for the government. He's picked to head this NRA, which in some ways is like Doge because it doesn't exist before the Roosevelt administration. And at the time he's picked to head it is not yet congressionally mandated. While he's there, Congress does pass the National Recovery Act, which does lead to the creation of the administration. However, by 1935, it is ruled unconstitutional and abolished by the Supreme Court. It's too late for Johnson, though, because he runs afoul of Roosevelt, and in 1933, he is on the cover of Time magazine, supplanting Roosevelt, who perhaps thought maybe he should have gotten that honor. But by 1934, Johnson is gone from the administration. So I think there are some interesting historical precedents that we can look at, and I'm going to be exploring this issue further in an upcoming article.
Well, again, that's fascinating. I truly wish, and this is just a wish, I know I'm not going to be alive 40 or 50 years from now, but from that vantage point, to look back at what's happening now will be fascinating and see what the judgment of history is on what's going on with this administration.
Yeah, true.
Absolutely. Hans, I see you're unmuted.
Yes, I have a question, if I may.
I thought you might.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you very much for an interesting talk. I really enjoyed it. Learned some new things, which is always good. The question I have touches more on the Supreme Court. Currently, we're seeing two powerful people, Musk and the president, sort of pushing the boundaries of the presidency and executive branch. And at some point, we hope that the judicial system will react, and primarily, of course, at the Supreme Court level. Do you expect that to happen, and are there precedents for that?
Well, it's already happening. I mean, it's not up to the Supreme Court yet, although the Supreme Court did make some ruling about the spending last week, but or the spending cuts, I would say last week. But the courts are weighing in on a number of Trump's actions, and that's just the way our system works. People are saying it's a constitutional crisis. It's not a constitutional crisis if the courts look at what the president's doing. It's a constitutional crisis if the courts say the president can't do something and then he does it anyway. And that has not happened. I want to be clear on that. But we'll see. Potentially it could happen. And Joe Biden did a little bit with the student loans when the Supreme Court said he couldn't do what he did, and then he went and tried to find a way to circumvent the Supreme Court. There's definitely precedents about this. I mean, in the Roosevelt administration, Franklin Roosevelt, that is, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of Roosevelt's New Deal programs were put to the Supreme Court test, and initially they did not survive. They were knocked out. Then Roosevelt comes forward with his court packing scheme, where he wants to add more justices to the Supreme Court. This is widely seen by history as a failure and an overreach by Roosevelt. However, the Supreme Court did change its tune after the threats from Roosevelt and became more amenable to New Deal legislation afterwards. So even though Roosevelt suffered a political black eye from the court packing scheme, as long as the president goes along with what the Supreme Court is doing, even if they grumble about it, I'm okay with it. But once you have a president say, kind of like Andrew Jackson said, Mr. Marshall about the Supreme Court, Mr. Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. That is a lawless approach, and I would hope we would not see that again.
Thank you.
Thank you. There was another question asking about Steve Jobs and if he was close with any president.
Sure. I did talk about Steve Jobs and the power of the money. Jobs was actually interesting in that, unlike most of these CEOs, he actually was able to stay away from government for the most part. I think it's in part because Apple is a luxury or premier product, and so it was a little less regulated by the federal government, but that doesn't mean he had no relationships with presidents. He got an award as a young entrepreneur from the George H.W. Bush White House, and he developed a friendship with Bill Clinton. They both like to do the New York Times crossword puzzle, and at one point he invites Clinton and says that when Chelsea's at Stanford, you could stay at one of my homes that's in or near Palo Alto. But he also advises Clinton on how to address the Lewinsky scandal, which is basically to own up and move on. And Clinton didn't seem that interested in that advice. So there is some relationship there.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Oh, yes, Liz.
Thank you. What worries me as much as the courts is the Congress, which is just rolled over on its back and basically given up its function to the president. And I don't know if there's any parallel for that in history. It seems to me to be just not understandable. And until the people give their Congress people an ultimatum to get us the heck out of this, it's going to continue. So I don't know if there's any precedent or comfort to be found in history with what the Congress is not doing.
Well, I would say that I'm good at precedent and less good at comfort. So I'll just I'll focus on the precedent part. But we're going to have an interesting live action shot here, because I will get up and go to my library and pull down a book that I recently put out. It's an edited volume, but it's called The Shifting 21st Century Presidency. And it looks at how the presidents of this century, not just Trump, but Bush and Obama and Trump and Biden and Trump again, have all taken on additional powers, in large part because of what you say, which is the Congress ceding its authority, Congress not wanting to do things. You've got people, both the left and the right, who say they would rather go on TV than legislate. They don't want to roll up their sleeves and do committee work. They want to go on MSNBC or Fox News, whichever side, and go fundraise. And so I wrote this book, or I put together this book. I asked a bunch of scholars, again, on left and right, to talk about how this is a problem. Because if you look at each president of the 21st century, you start with George W. Bush, he creates the Homeland Security state. He uses these aggressive signing statements, and he takes on more power. And then you look at Obama, he had the pen and the phone presidency. He does the DACA, Children of Illegal Immigrants, kind of the Dreamers not legislation, the Dreamers Act of not enforcing people who are of that status. And he does that, even though he says that he needs Congress to do it, he does it on his own. And then you have Trump, and we've already talked a little bit about that, but Trump seems to like the tariff and pardon authority because they're unilateral. He doesn't need to go through Congress. And then we look at Joe Biden. I already mentioned the student loans. And even though Nancy Pelosi told him he couldn't do that without Congress, he goes ahead and does it anyway. So each of these presidents have accreted additional power. And then if you add it all up in total, you have a presidency that is much larger and much more powerful than the presidency that Bill Clinton left at the end of the year 2000. So this 21st century presidency is more of a trend over the last 25 years rather than a break point. And it's something that I agree with you. We really need to address. I think Congress does need to reassert its authority, and we have a balance of powers for a reason. And I think we've become worrisomely unbalanced in recent years.
Interesting. Michael, I'm sorry.
If I may pursue that, I mean, I lived through war powers. I helped write the resolution. I mean, I've seen on the foreign affairs side the accretion of the power of the president, but I haven't seen anything like a president abolishing a government department by decree, firing 36,000 or however many, 60,000 people who are supposedly protected, by the Civil Service Act and other things, and having somebody in industry standing there with a chainsaw saying he's gonna, brutalize the government, which in fact he's doing, and having the Congress just sit there and applaud. I mean, to me, it's gotten to a level that is, beyond being sort of on the fence. Now, some of the stuff with Roosevelt, yes, that's maybe the closest, but this just seems to me to be so
yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned
huge that
it's interesting that you mentioned the Roosevelt example, because with Roosevelt, he was a Democrat and the target was industry. And with Hugh Johnson, they took a very heavy-handed approach to industry, where they basically said you have to comply with our regulations or you won't have government approval. You won't get the so-called Blue Eagle of the National Recovery Administration. Henry Ford said, I don't want that blue buzzard on my business anyway. But with Trump, it's different because the target is government. And so different power accretors have different targets. And I think that's interesting. But as far as abolishing government agencies by decree, we're going to see. I think that gets back to Hans's question about whether that is something that can actually pass muster. And I'm not sure what the constitutional authority to do that is. So let's see how that one plays out.
we've
Thank
never had
you.
one claimed royalty.
Okay, Michael, I think I
Yeah,
see your hands.
another example which could be cited, Tevi, would be in the Nixon administration in terms of the trend towards the imperial presidency. Nixon suggested, as I remember, that his guards and so forth and his associates should wear very formal military outfits. It didn't last very long and it boomeranged on him. But again, it's part of this gradual trend towards the imperial presidency. And I think the Nixon example is quite relevant here as well.
Yeah, I've actually looked at the Nixon thing, and the imperial presidency is something coined by Arthur Schlesinger, who's a critic of the administration. And it is true that Nixon wanted the fancy military garb for the military aides, although not for his not for his personal staff. But I always thought it was a little overstated. I don't see Nixon taking on additional powers. Now, he did commit crimes for which Congress went after him. But that, again, that was a time when Congress, in a bipartisan way, looked at the Watergate scandal, and I think acted appropriately in going after him and limiting what he was trying to do. But again, what he was trying to do was more about politics than about government power. Although sometimes he misused government power for what he hoped was political advantage. One of my favorite stories of this period is there was this guy named Tony Ulasewicz, who was a New York City police officer who was kind of one of the plumbers who was detailed to work with Nixon. And Nixon is raving on and on about the Brookings Institution, how he wants Ulasewicz to go set the place on fire or blow it up. And Ulasewicz leaves the meeting and goes to the library to figure out what the Brookings Institution is. So it was a bit of a Keystone Cop situation there.
That's funny. Well, I thought I saw another hand before we move on.
And it keeps going up.
Oh, okay, Liz, was there something else you wanted to add?
Well, just that in the Nixon administration, I guess he was my second favorite, but in the Nixon administration, at least when he did something patently illegal, everybody said, that's patently illegal. And, you know, we don't want it from a president. We're not living with that now, unfortunately.
When you say Nixon was your second favorite, I assume that's sarcasm, right?
Yeah, I mean, that makes the art of the possible impossible, or so far, anyhow.
Yeah,
Sorry.
so no, I mean it's an interesting point, but I think the fact is that we're looking at the Nixon administration in retrospect and saying the people said we don't want it. But if you remember, Nixon was reelected with a landslide victory in 1972. It took a while for the process to play out. And so I always think while you're in the middle of it, it's hard to judge historically. That's why I always I like to focus my talks on presidents who are in the rear view mirror, because that's where I can bring the judgment of history. And it's a little harder to do it about the contemporary situation because you don't know how it's going to play out yet.
I hope we all live to be able to look back at it.
Tevi, I had one more question. I don't know if others do or if we're at the end here, but what other topics are you considering for future books? Because you sure seem to pick some darn good topics.
You know, it's kind of funny because I was thinking about my books. I mean, I wrote my book about presidents and pop culture in 2013, and Obama was a very pop culture president, and then Trump also was a very pop culture infused. And then in 2016, I wrote a book, and you can see them over my shoulder again. But in 2016, I wrote a book about disasters in the presidency, where I warned that we have many, and this was from our time together at HHS, Carol, I warned that we had many countermeasures in the Strategic National Stockpile, but we had nothing in stock for coronavirus. And then in 2020, I wrote a book about Fight House, about infighting in the White House, which obviously was a big thing in the Trump years. And then, and now I wrote about presidents and CEOs. So I really think that if I do have this prophetic power, I would like my next book to be about rainbows and unicorns. So we can all...
Happy endings. How's that?
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions. I know you said you were going to take a break for questions. Was there more information you wanted to share with us before we end the program?
No, I'm good. Thank you for your thoughtful questions and the engaging conversation. And I hope you do purchase The Power and the Money and make it part of one of your subsequent conversations.
Oh, I am sure we will be talking about it and reading it. So again, thank you very much for your time, and thank you all for attending, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you.
Thank you, Tevi.